London School of Economics and Political Science. And I wanted to welcome everyone to this memorial to celebrate the life of Professor Sir John Hills, the Richard Titmuss Professor of Social Policy and the Chair of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion here at the LSE, who sadly passed away on the 21st of December, 2020. Due to the pandemic and lockdowns, we've waited until now to hold this memorial event so that we could come together in person to share our memories and reflections on John. I also wanted to welcome those who are joining us online, many of whom would have liked to have been here, but have been thwarted by various travel difficulties and other factors. And we're especially grateful to have Anne Power, John's wife, who is right there. Welcome, Anne. And her daughter, Carmen, who's also with us. Welcome, Carmen. And also John's sister, Catherine Hills, who's also with us today. We're very, very happy. There are also other family members joining us online. This memorial event is jointly hosted by the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion, CASE, the Suntory and Toyota International Center for Economics and Related Discipline, STICERD as we call it, the Department of Social Policy, and the International Inequalities Institute, III, all institutions where John played a significant role. Tanya Burkhardt, John's close colleague and former PhD student, will be co-chairing the event with me today. And we'll be joined by 13 speakers who will each provide a brief reflection on John's life. And after that, those in the audience will be invited to give any further thoughts they'd like to share, and then we'll be hosting a reception in the senior common room here at the LSE on the 5th floor of this building. We've been blessed with decent weather, and so we'll keep the windows open, both for COVID reasons and to give people a place to step outside if they need a moment for reflection or some fresh air. So please feel free to use the balconies throughout the event. And just a reminder to turn off your phones. I wanted to start with a few words from me. John Hills was a truly towering figure at LSE. He was a brilliant academic, of course, whose contributions to the fields of social policy, inequality, the welfare state, pensions, housing, and economics are unrivaled. He was also very tall, but he was towering, not like a building, but more like a tree, deeply grounded in the lives of people, with many branches under which others could find shelter and be nurtured, and spreading seeds far and wide that enabled others to grow and for ideas to spread. He was also the epitome of the values that we hold dear at LSE in the tradition of the Webbs and Tawney and Beveridge and many others, deeply committed to evidence and rooting analysis in rigor and debate, generous with colleagues who all got equal benefit of his wisdom and advice, whether they were an undergraduate or a prime minister. Determined to make sure that important research didn't lay dormant on the pages of books and journals, but be actively used in the world to improve people's lives. And always giving of himself to the benefit of others, as seen by the testimony of the many who worked with him, and so evident in the many institutions he helped to build here at LSE, CASE, STICERD, and III in particular. I personally experienced his generosity when I got interested in welfare state reform and the social contract when I was trying to write a book on the topic. And I was an interloper in a field that John had led for decades. And yet he patiently talked me through the risks of universal credit and what Beveridge really meant by social insurance. And when I sent him a draft chapter to review and comment on in August 2020, not realizing how unwell he was at the time, he apologized for not being able to send comments. But it was so typical of him that he really wanted to. People like John are very, very rare. brilliant and humane, leaving a legacy through his intellectual contributions, his institutional building, and all the people whose lives he had shaped, many of whom we'll hear from today. As someone who seeded a little bit of himself in all of us, and how lucky we were to know him. I'll now turn to our first contribution, which will be from the Right Honourable Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who I think needs no introduction. Let's hear from Gordon.
No one in his generation contributed more to independent social research than John Hills. No one has a more distinguished set of academic articles and scholarly literature on British social policy to his name than John Hills. And as a result, no one I know made a bigger contribution to government policies for social change than John Hills. I knew John and was privileged to benefit from John's advice and good judgment from the time he was involved in the LSE's welfare state programme, latterly as co-director. By 1997, the year Labour came into government, he was already a professor, and his research, analysis and wisdom contributed to major reforms in pensions, social housing and social security. And of course, his later work as director of the International Inequalities Institute and chair of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion informed his prodigious writing, including numerous books that will be a permanent monument to his great work. I was once a university lecturer too, and I always said that university stood for objectivity, impartiality, rationality, the search for truth and the disinterested pursuit of knowledge, the qualities you leave behind when you go into politics. But no one I know represented that idea for university and of university research better than John Hills. He cared deeply about social problems, lived his life in the service of social justice and a fairer society, but he also insisted, as befits more than a century of the history of the London School of Economics, that his research was independent, carried out in immaculate detail, through rational analysis, statistical precision, and peer group verification. And by this method, as well as his resulting conclusions, he will not only be remembered, but revered by a generation of students and scholars who may not now be able to be taught by John, who died sadly too young, but they and we will still benefit from an enduring legacy of honesty and unimpeachable integrity that was and is second to none.
Welcome everybody also from me, Tanya Burkhart, Associate Director in CASE, and one of the people who was nurtured under one of John's branches, in the very nice metaphor that Manoush used. So our second contribution today is also a video. This is from Lord Nicholas Stern, who was intending to be here, but unfortunately rail strikes made that impossible. Nick is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government, Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and Head of the India Observatory here at LSE. John and Nick both arrived at LSE in 1986 and together helped to build STICERD, together with the first chairs, Misho Morishima and Tony Atkinson. And John and Nick remained close colleagues and friends ever afterwards, with a particular interest in more recent years in discussing the problems of climate change. So we'll hear from Nick now.
I'm very sorry. I can't be with you on the day of the celebration of our wonderful friend, John. There's so many ways of reflecting on how we knew each other, how we worked together, as many of you will find if you think back. But in my case, I think there are a couple of decades that I would think about where we were particularly close. We both arrived at the LSE in 1986. I was almost 40, John was just past 30, full of the energies of youth or relative youth, of making things happen, very dynamic, cheerful time. But John was quite extraordinary in that even though he was just over 30, he had all the gravitas, all the thoughtfulness, all the ability to convey the big picture, whilst of course being deeply into the detail. He was already wise, and he already had that wonderful clarity of expression. Those were building years. Tony Atkinson, particularly as the second chair, really the first chair who was a real builder. Michio Morishima started it in a wonderful way and raised the resources. But it was Tony who really built STICERD, and I had the privilege of following him as chair of STICERD in 1988. There were wonderful building years, and John was so central to that whole building dynamism and activity that was going on there. He really carved out a whole area for himself. There were some common things, the way in which we thought about impact, the way in which we thought about distributional issues. We shared those, and I hope we shared the values. And we shared the excitement of being some of the first people to work with household data sets. But John was always John and himself, defining the issues in such a clear, strong, and innovative way. It was just a pleasure to be with him as a working colleague, as well as all the fun of being together and discussing sport and politics and everything else. The second decade was really the decade after I came back from being at the World Bank, the EBRD, and the UK Treasury. I came back to the LSE in 2007 after a dozen or so years away, and immediately the friendship with John and Anne picked up again. Of course, by then I'd started to work on climate change, a subject in which John had such a deep interest and deep knowledge. He was keenly aware of the science. He was keenly engaged on the ethical issues, and as always, deep down in the detail as well. And I remember him explaining to me very patiently the different costs and effectiveness of different kinds of double glazing and roof insulation and cladding and whether to fill in cavity walls. This was John all over, really big picture plus all the detail, and always, always practical, along with the deep conceptual theoretical understandings. I remember talking to him and Anne a lot about Pope Francis, and I think it's fair to say that with my background, the likelihood of my admiring and praising and getting involved with popes was rather small, but in this case, it happened. And around the time of Laudato Si in 2015, the Pope's famous encyclical on environment and climate, I remember with Anne and John talking at length in detail about the role of values and philosophy and religion in this whole set of issues. That was inside in those periods that we talked so much. But I also saw John on the outside. We listened to him, of course, many times on Radio 4 and the Today program. I saw him not so long ago deliver with great clarity evidence on universal credit when I was sitting on the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee. It's remarkable how concentration right round the table went up when John spoke. You knew you had to listen. You knew you would gain from listening. And I remember at one point discussing with a BBC producer how academics had so much to learn about how to get simple messages across in ways which people would respect, understand, and enjoy. And the very first example that BBC producer gave me was John Hills, and I think we can all see why. I wanted to reflect for a moment on John together with Tony Atkinson. They were such close friends. They were so close, not only personally, but in their love of cricket, in their deep interest in politics, in their very strong value systems that they brought to everything that they touched. They were enormously fond of each other, great mutual admiration, and we should, I hope we can, remember those two together because they were so close. Also, I think we should remember John together with Tony and William Beveridge and Richard Titmuss. We have some very great people in the UK on social policy. Beveridge, Titmuss, Atkinson, and John Hills. He was one of those four. He really stood out, and we were so lucky to be academics and friends with him. But let me end on the friendship. Life isn't always easy. You've got things to do, pressures come, you've got problems. But when you bumped into John around in the famous water cooler or cup of tea, you immediately perked up. You immediately smiled because John smiled at you. He had some wonderful story to tell, and he brought that goodness and warmth to every personal interaction. He made you happy, and that's an enormous, enormous gift. It's not just the gift of friendship, it's the gift of friendship that cheers you up, and that is very special. And John just carried that with him. And I remember he told me once, and I've repeated it to so many friends since, this way of thinking the good things, worrying about the world, but at the same time realizing that it is possible to make things better, that good things do happen. And he told me that at the end of the day, he used to write down the good things that had happened that day. That's John the good, John the wise, John the friend, John the person who made us happy. And we were so fortunate to have known him. He made our lives richer. He made the world a much better place. John, we're so fortunate to have had the chance to be with you, work with you, and be a friend.
So we're very delighted that so many of you could make it here in person today, but we're aware there are very many special and important people to John, and for whom John was important, who weren't able to be here today. And it's very nice that we've been able to hear from two of those via video. And I'm also very pleased that there are many people joining online. We're also recording the event, so others who weren't able to join either online or in person today will be able to view it at a later date. But I'd like to welcome now our first in-person contributor, Professor Coretta Phillips, who's Professor of Criminology and Social Policy here in the Department of Social Policy at LSE. Her research interests lie in the field of race, ethnicity, crime, criminal justice, and social policy. And her book, Multicultural Prison, jointly won the Criminology Book Prize in 2013. And she worked with John in the Department of Social Policy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to Think and Remember John at this excellent event. My first interaction with John was in the Department of Social Policy, and our interaction was in a course that John had, I think, set up and managed very successfully for many years. It was an MSc course that was, I think, quite unique in trying to expose students to a range of methodological principles, but then to look at their application in social policy research. So it wasn't a straightforward methods course. And I learned a lot from him as a teacher. I found him really impressive in the classroom. I learned a lot. It was my first teaching job. And I felt like I learned from somebody who was really respectful of students' interests, of their questions and their ideas. And he took teaching seriously, perhaps at a time when that wasn't always the case at institutions like the LSE and perhaps across higher education more generally. And I think he was characteristically generous in giving me feedback, positive feedback on my teaching, and I really valued that about him. I think the work that John has done across many years, and that most informed my research at least, was the work that he did as chair of the National Equality Panel. And in that, drawing together the work of others, he brought together and I think informed our understanding of educational attainment, in particular, and labour market outcomes, particularly in the intersection of ethnicity, gender and religion in a way that hadn't been done very much previously. And that work, I think, was really valuable for understanding those dimensions of identity, their independent effects. But he also, in that work with others, brought together, I think, the importance of thinking about within group variation. And he also, along with Kitty, gave me an opportunity to contribute a chapter to an edited volume that he wrote, 2 edited volumes, in fact, on New Labour performance. And it was interesting because at the time we were all, of course, very critical of New Labour, but I wonder how many people in the room now would prefer to have New Labour back again, or maybe even old Labour. So I have to say, I can't claim to know John, to have known John very well, but what I did know, I liked immensely. He was a really important professorial colleague. And I like the fact that he sat within multiple constituencies. So he was an economist, but not a traditionalist, with a big social policy hat. He was a research centre director with an awareness and appreciation of a range of research approaches across the methodological spectrum. And then more recently involved in the International Inequalities Institute. He was also engaged with a diversity of epistemological positions, and I really respected and appreciated the respect that he showed others. And these qualities were also, I think, really evident in the work that we did on the REF. Importantly, John always carried his fair share of the workload. He didn't have professorial pretensions, so to speak. He was generous in that regard. And he was also generous in his reviews of colleagues' work. And as the junior member of the REF team, I really valued his wise counsel and his careful reflections on how the LSE way of doing things would be interpreted by the REF panel. I'm not sure that it's often we can say that we genuinely miss an academic colleague, and that may sound harsh, but I think it's in part because much of our work is external focused with our research constituents, or perhaps we work alongside a colleague in our teaching. But I can genuinely say that I've missed John, and I feel enormously sad that he's no longer my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Coretta. Our next tribute comes from Mike Savage, but he also can't be here in person. And I'm very pleased that Amina Ishkanian will read his contribution, and also one from colleagues at the International Inequalities Institute. Amina is an associate professor in the Department of Social Policy and the executive director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Programme at the III, and also knew John very well.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. So I'm reading the first contribution from Mike. I had only met John once briefly before joining the LSE in 2012. Of course, I knew him by reputation as a towering figure, the person who above all encapsulated the best aspects of the great LSE Fabian tradition and had placed the issue of equality at the heart of government thinking, especially in the Labour governments of 1997 to 2010. It was therefore a wonderful surprise to actually work closely with John in setting up the International Inequalities Institute. Far from trying to assert himself as the senior figure, which he decidedly was, he was warm and inclusive to me and made it clear how much he valued my presence. I quickly realized that his deep commitment to social justice ran all the way through his everyday working life. He was the quintessential academic, deeply concerned with academic excellence, but he never let this distract from the fundamental need for this to be directed towards the betterment of society. John combined this with immense collegiality, and even in the stressful times of setting up the III, there was simply no possibility that he would forget to do things or let people down. John's extraordinary work ethic sustained him under what to most of us would have seemed an impossible burden. Even when working under enormous pressure, he was unfailingly kind, courteous, and cheerful. A twinkle in his eye betokening a keen sense of humor beneath the surface of his quiet authority. And of course, utterly unselfish as he was, he never drew attention to his pioneering role, nor he claimed any kind of proprietorial rights over how the International Inequalities Institute or the Atlantic Fellows Program for Social and Economic Equity should develop. John had no time for petty careerism, and he was entirely committed to doing the right thing for its own sake. Working with John has been the greatest privilege of my career, and I sorely miss him. Mike Savage. And this contribution was written by Professor Nicola Lacey, Professor Mike Savage, Professor David Soskis, myself, and Lisa Ryan, the manager of the Inequalities Institute. We wish to pay tribute to John as one of the most remarkable academics we have ever known and worked with. He was utterly fair in everything he did and completely committed to principles of social justice, not just in abstract terms, but also in his daily work. We saw him as the personification of the very best aspects of LSE's Fabian tradition, committed to using academic work not as an ivory tower pursuit, but to make the world a better place. In 2014, in the midst of austerity politics and the increasing academic and public recognition of the ills of escalating inequality, John could have easily taken the view that the Center for the Analysis of Social Exclusion, which he had built over the previous two decades, was already a leading LSE force in this arena, and that there was no need to develop a brand new initiative. He might also have taken the view that at this stage of his distinguished career, there was no need to put his shoulder to the wheel of a brand new, untried and risky venture, but that was not his way. John did not have a single instrumental or game-playing bone in his body, and he realized intuitively the value of a new International Inequalities Institute, not housed in a specific department, but working across the entire LSE to raise the stakes of inequality research to an even higher level. Accordingly, he enthusiastically agreed to work with Mike as co-director of the III from 2015 until he stepped down in 2018. The deep admiration with which John was regarded across the LSE and the trust which colleagues felt in him as not only a distinguished scholar, but also a generous and gifted institution builder were the foundation stones upon which the International Inequalities Institute was built, from the bottom up, with wide and enduring support. John was an absolute pleasure to work with as co-director and colleague within the III. We had absolute confidence in him to make the right decisions, reached with full consultation. He had no interest in personal self-aggrandizement. It was he who held the initial conversations with the Atlantic Philanthropies and inspired the vision, which was to lead to the major investment in the Atlantic Fellows Program for Social and Economic Equity, AFSE. In fact, this was the largest gift the LSE had ever received, £64 million. The time and effort which he put into this initiative was staggering. John's extraordinary work ethic sustained him under what to most of us would have seemed an impossible burden. Even when working under enormous pressure, he was unfailingly kind, courteous, and cheerful. He had a twinkle in his eye betokening a keen sense of humor beneath the surface of his quiet authority. And of course, utterly unselfish as he was, he never drew attention to his pioneering role, nor claimed any kind of proprietarial rights. John's approach was committed to doing the right thing for its own sake, and this informed his own actions. He shunned the kind of academic globetrotting that he saw as environmentally damaging. This is before it became popular to do so, if I can add that. And he refused to commit to international travel as a normal part of academic life. John was utterly loyal to the LSE Yet when he disagreed with the actions of senior management, he was utterly fearless in making his views clear without a care for any retribution he might personally experience. Time and again, we witnessed his generosity and his kindness to students, as well as academic and professional colleagues. He joyfully shared in the occasional pleasures and commiserated with the daily frustrations of those around him. He was a truly outstanding man who will be deeply missed by all of us at the International Inequalities Institute and by all the many students and colleagues who have been inspired by him over the many years. More than that, in the already grim year of 2020, that was the most devastating news.
Thank you, Amina. I'd now like to welcome Kitty Stewart, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Social Policy and an Associate Director of CASE. Kitty joined as a postdoctoral fellow in 2001, and it's our great gain that she never left. Kitty.
Thank you. It's so hard to put into words what John meant to CASE as an institution and to each of us, the people in CASE. The hole that he has left is immense. Abigail, who's now the director of CASE, has said that she came to CASE because of John, and she stayed because of John. And I'd say that that's also true for Polly and Tanya and me, now CASE associate directors. All of us, in a sense, grew up in CASE. We've all been there, each of us now for more than 20 years. And to us and to so many others who are part of the CASE extended family, John was an inspiration, academic guiding light, moral compass, warm, generous and supportive colleague and friend. First and most obvious, there was John's giant and unique intellect. Nick Stern has already referred to his remarkable capacity to see both the smallest detail and the big picture and the key story. Watching that in action was something really special. As part of the series of projects that we've done, tracking UK government policy and its impact on poverty and inequality, which Greta contributed her chapters to, we've had many meetings over the years presenting to each other emerging findings from different parts of the project, different aspects of the welfare state. And from the massive detail, John would see the patterns, make links between different strands, coin a perfect phrase. It sometimes really felt like magic was being created in the room. Magic, of course, always carefully rooted in precise and impartial analysis of the data. At the same time, John had a strong sense of what we might call moral priority or urgency. He always focused on questions that were important, that mattered to the kind of society that we live in. And it was always clear what he thought the point of social policy research was: to make policy better and society fairer. He had stronger integrity in his work and in the way that he lived than anyone else that I know. But he was never judgmental. He seemed to assume always that we all had the same standards and values, and so one wanted to live up to them, to be better. One thing that I think says a lot about John is his office. His CASE office was very small, and it looked onto a light well. You may have noticed that and been surprised if you visited him there, given his status. When we moved into that building on Lincoln's Inn Fields, he could have had a great big corner office with a lovely view. But it was a little bit separate from the rest of the CASE space. And he wanted to be at the heart of the centre, accessible. He thought that was important. So quietly, not a big fuss, he took the small office. That to me is leadership. And that was John. He was always extremely busy. So that small office was, piles of paper on every surface. He'd have to sweep some off a chair so that you could sit down. But he was incredibly generous with his time and his ideas, giving comments on drafts, talking through early research plans. He was interested and excited by other people's work, keen to hear more. How was it going? What were we finding? What was coming out? Especially for a junior researcher, that is so important. And I think it was really instrumental in making CASE the place that it was. He was also interested in us as people. He worried about us. He remembered what our children were up to. And he loved it if we noticed the pile of science textbooks that were on his desk in recent years, and he could tell us how he and Lucia were getting on with A-level biology. That genuine interest in other people was one part of what made John a brilliant teacher. I went to some training quite a few years ago now, where they said that students are really looking for 3 things in a teacher: clarity, charisma, and care. And I thought they're describing John. John was also someone who really enjoyed life in all its aspects, well beyond work. He'd always read or watched something that was worth recommending. In the last CASE Zoom tea that he came to, he was enthusing about a documentary that he and Anne had seen called The Great Mountain Sheep Gather, about the Lake District, which of course he and John loved and she and Anne loved and spent lots of time there. He'd always come to watch the World Cup matches when the IT team fixed that up in STICERD. He was always there. He was always at the STICERD Christmas quiz with a paper hat and his big smile. And it was great to be on his quiz team. Of course, partly because it gave you like vastly increased chance of winning, but also because he entered into the spirit of it. He made things fun. I think, as Nick has said, better actually. He made you happier. We really miss you, John. Because you were so modest, I'm sure that we miss you far more than you would ever have imagined. But I hope you had some sense of how much difference you made to so many people, not only through your impact on policy, but also to the people who had the privilege to know you and work with you personally. I feel incredibly lucky to have been one of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kitty. Our next speaker is Francesca Bastagli, who is Director of the Equity and Social Policy at the Overseas Development Institute, which is a global think tank, as I'm sure many of you know. There, Francesca leads a team working on poverty, inequality, education, health and social protection, overseeing both analytical and policy advisory work on these topics. John was Francesca's PhD supervisor in the mid-2000s, and she worked with him on income and wealth inequality and on the balance and trade-offs of public and private welfare. Francesca.
Thank you, Tanya. John started his career as an ODI fellow in Botswana in 1976 and later worked with the Commission on Taxation in Zimbabwe. So in the initial stages of his career, he researched and wrote about social security in low and middle income countries, alongside, of course, his research on the UK and higher income countries. He then made a considered and explicit decision to concentrate on the UK and British social policy, which was wonderful, of course, for the UK. And of course, he continued then to carry out comparative research, focusing on the EU and OECD, so higher income countries. But despite this geographical focus of much of the bulk of his inequality and social policy work, the relevance and influence of his work goes beyond the confines of these countries and is truly global. And I'm going to mention just 2 broad reasons why this is. The first concerns John's seminal contributions on the principles and foundations of social policy, together with his approach to studying policy and informing policymaking. These have universal value and are today more than ever relevant and needed in national and international analysis and debate. And I'll give some examples of what I mean. A recurrent theme in John's work is that welfare policy's multiple objectives need to be considered jointly if we're to build systems that are effective and politically and financially sustainable. In a world where welfare policy is in many contexts still framed or increasingly framed in narrow terms of poverty reduction and safety nets, this remains an urgent priority. Related to this, John's work on the dynamics of people's changing circumstances, his life course approach to analyzing policy provides a fundamental complement and advancement to static poverty studies in support of better informed policy design. John's work on investigations into the role of different actors, the state, private sector, and individuals in financing, managing, and delivering services provide a benchmark and a framework as we navigate ongoing trends, such as the ongoing shifts away from collective responsibility to individual responsibility, and as the private sector takes on a growing role in the provision of essential services. John's work on policy financing and the role of taxation emphasizes how looking only at social spending at best presents an incomplete picture of policy impact, and that strengthening the equity and progressiveness of domestic and international tax systems is key. We need to continue to look at both sides of the coin. John's impressive, in my mind, unmatched knowledge of the detail of policy design and administration that we've heard about is an ongoing reminder of the importance of such details in carrying out meaningful policy analysis, and cautions against making sweeping assumptions about how policy works, which is what many researchers do, partly because administrative issues are somehow considered to be less hot. Alongside his meticulous attention to detail, John never lost sight of the bigger picture, as we've heard, of the policy questions that really matter, making sure that analytical findings are accessible, that they can be used and taken up and used in policy decisions. And this is a guiding principle for many of us as well. So John applied these principles and approaches to a range of social policy areas. And this was one of his remarkable aspects and characteristics of John, including in areas that are particularly complex and that most people I know steer clear of. And also on issues that are at the center of some of the biggest global challenges of our times, beyond, frankly, the reality of the UK. And these include his work on measuring and analyzing wealth inequality, pensions and pension reform, and increasingly work also around climate change. But the second channel through which John's legacy continues is through his former students, of which I'm so privileged and fortunate to have been one of. Since John's passing on the 21st of December 2020, former students of John's have come forward to share their experience from across a range of organizations, and you will find them in central banks, in UN agencies, trade unions, government departments, and academic institutions across the globe. The stories and memories shared have common themes and echo my own experience as a PhD student of John's. And we hear about how John's teaching shapes the type of questions we ask, our approach to answering these questions, and how we engage or try to engage with the world of policy making. This is all a testament to John's extraordinary qualities as an academic, but it's also testament to John's manner of approaching and responding to people. Across the board, these shared memories reflect the ways in which John listened, provided guidance and support, found interest and potential in people's ideas and their work. In a world that's increasingly loud, aggressive, and competitive, and where these traits are often rewarded, John stood out as someone who saw or who listened and heard through the noise and placed a value on substance and on what matters to fairness and justice, both in the public policy sphere, but also in the way we conduct ourselves day to day. I'm very grateful to have had the chance to tell him directly in a letter I wrote him. He was already unwell and in hospital. But I told him directly that how for me he was an example almost daily in facing dilemmas and difficult questions in research and advisory work, but also in management decisions. His razor-sharp focus on the essential, his unwavering commitment to social justice, his kind and constructive ways, and his sense of humor, because as we've heard, John was funny. He really was. He had a sharp wit, and we laughed many times, also in sometimes very difficult situations. All of these guide my own ways of working as I ask myself, what would John do? So to Anne, to Catherine, to Carmen, to John's family, to his colleagues and to his friends, I'm close to you in your grief. I hope you draw at least some comfort in the thought that there are former students of John's working across the globe, driven and inspired by his example. Many of them are asking probably in this very moment, what would John do as we continue to take forward the agendas that John did so much to advance to make this a more equal and better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Our next contributor is Dame Sue Owen. Sue met John back in 1973 at Cambridge. Sue was an academic economist for 10 years at Cardiff and then at the LSE Centre for Labour Economics. She was then a civil servant for 30 years, working at a range of departments, including the Treasury, Foreign Office, Department for International Development, Department for Work and Pensions, and culminating as the Permanent Secretary at Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and as Civil Service Diversity and Inclusion Champion. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you. So everyone today knows what a lovely, kind and brilliant man John was. And the most impressive thing for me was the way he stuck to his values. He persevered in finding hard evidence to illustrate the deep and growing inequalities in Britain. And he had this remarkable ingenuity in setting out simple steps to improve things, as Nick Stearns said. So others today have talked a lot about his work at the LSE and ODI, and I just wanted to add three personal memories for you. So I first met John at Cambridge in November 1973, along with his friend Gordon Clark. And it was Gordon's tragic death by lightning at the end of our first year that cemented my friendship with John. I've been struggling to find a photo of John from that period, and I actually couldn't find one. So the photo up there is actually of John 10 years later in 1983, when he came to visit Martin and me in Cardiff. And you can see he was then sporting a trendy beard. When I first met John, though, he was a mathematician. I'm not sure how many people know that. And he was also, in our first year, he was impossibly sophisticated. He did stuff I'd never even heard of, like play mahjong. And he was one of the editors on the student newspaper Stop Press. He played croquet and he spoke at the Union. He was also a bit of a cook. He actually knew someone who had a Le Creuset casserole, which he was able to borrow. And it didn't get everything right. I mean, there was an occasion when the recipe said a clove of garlic and a whole head went in. And he asked me to cook the rice, and he'd bought pudding rice. So there we go. But he was also the spitting image of that low cartoon of Keynes that's up there. And I think the front of this program today shows just how similar he and Keynes looked. So I suggested that he might want to change to economics, which he did. And I think that's one of my greatest contributions to society, is getting John to change from maths to economics. So my second memory of John is his immense patience with lesser minds and his ability to portray complex ideas simply. So in my third year, he used to help me and my friend Anne Duncan with statistics, and he used to try and explain general equilibrium theory by thinking about suspension bridges, and it all seemed so much easier then. And he also used to use pictures rather than words in a PowerPoint. And that's something I've always followed him. People will remember the picture, they won't remember the words. And when he did his inaugural lecture here at the LSE, he described the distribution of income as being like the roof of that Russian Orthodox Church, where everyone's always looking upwards. So even if you're right at the top, the people are just looking at the people who are further up, and they can't see all those people lower down. And that image has stuck with me all my life. The third thing I remember about John was his complete inability to panic. He was always able to cope with setbacks, and there were many. But one I recall was when he went as an ODI fellow to Gaborone. And this was in the late 1970s, and calculators in those days were really expensive. I mean, in today's prices, they'd be probably like £200 or something. Anyway, unfortunately, John took his calculator. He did buy one. He took it out with him to Botswana, and he lost it. Indeed, he lost it many times. Actually, at points, he lost it daily. But as there was only one calculator in Gaborone at the time, it always turned up. So those are my three memories I want to leave you with, John, as illustrated up there. But finally, and I'm sorry to end on a money note, I think there's some positive things that we can do for John, which is to continue to support Trafford Hall and the National Communities Resource Centre, which Anne chairs. And John was so proud of her and the work that NCRC does. So we have already raised over £30,000 from over 100 people, some of whom are in this room. And you can now donate on the People's fundraising website. The link is there. Please do it. In fact, do it today. Don't leave it till tomorrow. Even a small amount will count. And please tell your friends and colleagues so that we can invest in an outdoor classroom, I think is what Anne has in mind, that will be in John's memory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. The next contribution comes from Bruce Katz, which I will read because Bruce is sadly unable to be here due to COVID. Bruce is an urban policy expert and director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University. And this is what Bruce writes. When I think of John, I'm reminded of what President John F. Kennedy said at a dinner he held for Nobel Prize winners in April 1962. I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. John was a singular, extraordinary person. As one of the world's leading experts on poverty and inequality, his imprint on government policy was far and wide and long-lasting, delivered through his research, lectures, writings, and stints on key government commissions. His knowledge of social policy was vast, and his commitment to societal change was deep and relentless. He brought rigor, discipline, and creativity to all that he did, building a rich and textured body of work. I first met John through Anne, who I encountered through mutual friends and our related work on housing and neighbourhoods. What began as a brief study tour in 2002 evolved into a 20-year partnership with Case, John and Anne that is ongoing, with transatlantic collaborations on the revitalisation of former industrial cities, the transformation of public housing and council estates, and more. Most of us are fortunate enough to have our professional lives shaped by people who act as mentors, tutors, or colleagues. John played all of those roles for me. He selflessly opened up his Rolodex, widening my circle of innovative thinkers and doers. He passed on his wealth of substantive knowledge, sharing his approach to solving problems and driving impact. He enabled me to move projects from concept to evaluation and execution. He was generous with time and thought. In the end, my enduring image of John is sitting round a dinner table with an enormous smile on his face, gladly explaining the latest developments in the roller coaster ride that is uniquely British politics. More than anything else, John taught me that it's not sufficient to bring purpose to professional life. One must also bring a sense of joy. That's Bruce's contribution. I'd next like to invite Stephen Aldridge, Chief Economist and Director for Analysis and Data at the Department, and I'm going to take a breath here, for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. He's also worked in various predecessors of that department and also at the Department of Trade and Industry, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury. Stephen and his team worked closely with John Hills over many years during his time at LSE.
Thank you very much. It's a real honour to be invited to speak at this event, and I'm very, very grateful. I've been trying to remember exactly when I first met John and became familiar with his work. It's a long time ago. It must be at least 30 or 35 years. John and his work has had an influence on me and the work I've been involved in pretty well throughout my career. And that's a reflection of his personal qualities, as others have already said, always keen to help others, his patience in explaining things, his desire to make a difference, and the quality of his work, rigorous, insightful, and perhaps most important if you're a civil servant, incredibly clear. John's influence extends across many areas of public policy, as we've heard: poverty, inequality, pensions, and much else. I've been asked to say a few words about his influence on housing policy, and in particular, social housing. Before I get into social housing, I just wanted to note that John's contribution to housing economics and policy was broad and varied. And I wanted to reflect in particular one contribution that he made, which was a book called Unravelling Housing Finance, Subsidies, Benefits and Taxation. It was written in 1990, but it's proved an incredibly useful guide to housing finance from the moment I came across it. And one small thing, but it was incredibly important to me, was it taught me the importance of the concept of an economic subsidy. But to social housing, in 2006, John was asked by Ruth Kelly, the then Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, to write a report on the role of social housing. The report that followed, The Ends and Means, the Future Roles of Social Housing in England, was and is a seminal document. Rereading it, as I've done 15 years later, I'm struck by how no less relevant it is today than when it was first written. The report sought to address a number of fundamental questions. If people cannot afford decent housing, why should we provide or support the provision of social housing rather than just transferring cash to them through the social security system? What's the case for providing social housing at sub-market rents rather than at market prices supported by welfare benefits? How best can social housing help people get on in life? And what can social housing do to create genuinely mixed communities? To address those questions, John began by looking at the characteristics of those in social housing. He found that in the 25 years to 2006, the role of social housing had changed significantly. While post-war provision was aimed at households on a range of income, provision had become more tightly constrained, with new lettings focused on those in greatest need. As a result, the composition of tenants changed, with more tenants much more likely to have low incomes and not to be in employment than in the past, or compared with those in other tenures. In 2006, 34% of all social tenants were in the poorest fifth of the income distribution. The proportion of social renters in employment fell from 47% to 32% between 1981 and 2006. And social tenants had higher rates of disability, were more likely to be lone parents or single people, and to be aged over 60. And more than a quarter of all minority ethnic householders were social tenants, compared with 17% of white householders. What's interesting, and why I would argue his report is still relevant today, is how similar the picture is currently. Indeed, the size of the sector has not changed much. There are still 4 million households in the sector, but the stock owned by housing associations is now larger than that owned by local authorities. But provision has become even more tightly constrained. 50% of all social tenants are now in the poorest fifth of the income distribution. 55% of households in the social rented sector have someone with a disability or a long-term illness. 22% of households are lone parents. Ethnic minority householders also remain much more likely to live in social housing. John reviewed how social housing performed in terms of decency, affordability, tenant satisfaction, and the contribution to people's livelihoods. It's interesting again to compare what he found with the position today. In many respects, there is progress. In terms of decency, huge strides have been made. 13% of social homes fail to meet the decent home standards today, down from almost a third at the time of his report. In terms of affordability, social tenants spend on average around a quarter of their income on their rent, much the same as when John was writing. In terms of tenant satisfaction, nearly 80% of social tenants say they are very or fairly satisfied. However, it remains the case that younger social renters are less satisfied than older social renters. And there's dissatisfaction in particular with aspects of social housing provision, including maintenance and repairs, which I'll come back to. In terms of poverty, however, the gap between social renters and homeowners has become wider. 46% of social renters were in relative poverty in 2019-20, and that compared to about 15% of people who owned their own home outright and 11% who had a mortgage. By contrast, in 2006, poverty rates of people living in social housing were double those of the population as a whole. Progress has clearly been made in some respects, but in other areas, there's clearly more to do. And it was against that backdrop that John tried to set out what were the economic and other arguments for social housing. And he detailed arguments around paternalism, merit-good arguments, and externalities. He then set out 6 key arguments for the provision of submarket social rent housing by not-for-profit landlords. Again, this all seems very, very relevant to me today. Worries about how the alternative of untied cash transfers would be spent. Worries about the quality of housing in the private rented sector, particularly for those on low incomes. Worries about the value for money if demand-side subsidies simply push up the price of a fixed supply of social housing. Worries about geographical segregation if housing decisions are left entirely to the market, and equity reasons for subsidy to social tenants to balance the advantages of those in other tenures, including, for example, favourable tax treatment or inheritance. None of that meant that John shied away from arguing the case for reform. He made the case for social housing, but it didn't have to be the same as it was today. He was clearly struck by the fact that social tenants were more likely to report dissatisfaction with aspects of their housing than residents in other tenures. He noted the lack of choice or options open to social tenants. He was struck by the fact that employment rates of those living in social housing were often lower or substantially lower than those with similar disadvantages living in other tenures, notwithstanding the positive incentive effects offered by submarket rents. And he was clearly struck too by the missed opportunity to retain high income tenants by improving neighbourhood conditions and thus building more mixed communities. If you compare, for example, what John had to say about the reform of social housing with the themes in the recent social housing white paper, you'll find a lot in common. Indeed, many of the issues he was addressing are also issues that we're seeking to address following the Grenfell Tower fire. The social housing white paper recently emphasised the importance of improving services to tenants, giving tenants a stronger voice, and using social housing as a first step to home ownership. John set out 4 key directions for the future of social housing: increasing the attention given to the existing stock and tenant population, for example, by strengthening options to give tenants more voice and improving the quality of management, supporting mixed incomes within existing communities by reviewing allocation policies or encouraging landlords to find ways to diversify their stock, supporting livelihoods, for example, by creating stronger links between employment and housing services, and offering a more varied menu to tenants, including, for example, enabling additional payments on top of rent for those whose circumstances improve to enable them to purchase part of the equity of their social home, something which was picked up very recently in the social housing white paper. Just to emphasize again that John also stressed in the report the need not just to focus, as we've perhaps tended to do for some time, on new housing supply, whether housing for sale or social housing. Only now have I think we got the message that the existing stock and how it's managed matter too. Rereading John's report, it's remarkable how timeless its proposed reforms are. They fit perfectly, in my view, with the goals and direction the department set out recently in, for example, the Levelling Up white paper. They are as fresh and relevant today as they were when they were first written. So I've no doubt that we need to continue to draw on John's work in developing and designing policies to social housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, and I'm sure John would very much have approved of your precision in introducing statistics into this memorial event. So thank you very much for bringing that. So our next speaker is Torsten Bell. Torsten is Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation. He previously worked as Director of Policy for the Labour Party and was a member of the Treasury's Council of Economic Advisors during the financial crisis, although I don't think we can hold him personally responsible for the crisis as a whole. John's work, Torsten has said, continues to inform almost every area of the Resolution Foundation's research, with its focus on living standards, particularly for households on low and middle incomes. Torsten.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And I was actually starting to worry what would happen to the space-time continuum if this kind of people got together and no one read out any statistics. So, Stephen, you have saved us all from that worry. Now, I think I first met John with politicians. Okay, and I've got a memory of one particular occasion and the style of John on these occasions, which is when a politician said something obvious, John would say, yes. When they said something wrong, there may have not been an equal split between these two. When they said something wrong, he would pause and say, maybe, but, and we would move along. I thought I would offer some reflections on John from the perspective, not just of myself, but of the organisation that I lead, the main message I would like to leave you with is that in almost everything we do and in how we do it, John is the role model, almost every day. Not intentionally, and actually the passing of John has probably made me realise that significantly more, but I wanted to talk about his shoulders, not because his shoulders were his defining or best feature, unless you think that. I think personally, his cheeky, sparkling eyes were probably the thing that stays with me most, but because I wanted to offer reflections on standing on those shoulders, as all of us do, and hopefully will do in the years ahead. Sometimes that was very, very literal. You would go into John's office, you would say, I have a problem. He would give you the spreadsheet. You would be very happy afterwards. Most often it's because you'd be working on subjects that he had been there long, long before, on the important ones too. We've talked already about inequality, housing, definitely, pensions, but a whole host of others too. And they weren't just the obvious ones. He hadn't always gone to the ones that everyone had been working on and that you'd eventually got round to going to. He went to the ones where social and economic change told you something was going to matter in the years ahead. Intergenerational differences across the UK. Wealth, I think, is a huge issue where he has led the way, and he pointed the way to those issues that weren't getting the attention they deserved. Climate, as many people have said before, it was fashionable before. Not going on planes wasn't mandated by the law. Now, another thing that I found with John is often you wouldn't know you were standing on his shoulders because he'd have said something to you a long time before. You would then go off and do a research. You would find the answer. You come back to talk to him about the research and he would be very enthusiastic and he would share the answer. And then later you'd pick up a book he'd written maybe 5 years before And you'd find out not only had he come to the same conclusion, he had done it better, he'd said it better, and he hadn't crushed your self-esteem in the process. Now, standing on shoulders isn't just about the normal way of thinking about that in terms of scientific progress. Okay, with John, I think it really is, as we've heard repeatedly today, about a role model of how to do this business well and what it is about. A role model for combining that rigorous research with that passion for social change and for social justice, for building institutions, that it isn't just about you as an individual, that progress comes from institutions that are built, that last, that nurture future generations, that go on to make change in ways you didn't possibly imagine when you set it up. That in the end, this is about papers, but it's much more about policy and it's about people. I think the social housing work speaks very powerfully if you read it. Yes, there are many stats in those papers, but there are also important lessons about people, and including when there are hard lessons for policymakers who didn't want to hear about those things. He proved that it is your job to communicate complex ideas clearly, and it could be done, or at least he could do it. And that is an important lesson for all of us. It's not absolutely clear that every aspect of academia or indeed the world has learned that, but it was important. I think he's also taught us an important lesson, which is spending as much of your life as possible in the Lake District is a very good idea. I've got memories of him zooming into meetings, slightly dodgy connection, of that brought the charm, and would be in the background often, wandering around. He would be feeding directly into us in London, telling us what the answer was. And I always used to think to myself, I mean, I'm biased, okay, I quite like the Lake District myself, but mountains are important because they force you to lift up your sights. Right, and that's what you should be doing in life, not just in holidays. And I think that is important for all of us to take. So I just thought I would just, as I say, on shoulders. John's were higher, literally, but also importantly than the rest of us. They were broader and they were always offered. We, at least, and I know most people in this room, will be standing on those shoulders in the years ahead. And I think we should all hope that means that John will be changing the world for decades to come too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torsten. Our next speaker is Polly Toynbee. She's a political and social commentator for The Guardian and former BBC Social Affairs editor. She knew John for many years, and he was a teacher and mentor in Polly's writing and reporting about poverty and inequality.
Well, lots of others of you here have been students of John's, and you've been lucky enough to have this great giant of social policy as your mentor, as in your academic work, committed to his way of researching, writing, and above all, thinking. Well, I never studied sociology or economics or social policy, but like so many dilettante journalists, I set out to report on social conditions, absolute ignorance of these disciplines. So I've always been immensely grateful to academics, to specialists, experts, willing patiently to explain to me, to educate me, to expound. Many of you are here today, but none gave me, and other journalists, and as Gordon Brown said, politicians too, so much time, so generously and considerately as John Hills. He was not only a great exponent of the causes and cures of poverty, inequality, and social exclusion, but he had a rare talent for making his research accessible with a luminous clarity. He talked human. His books shrugged off sometimes impenetrable language of academic sociology, and that's part of why he had such great influence and authority. Of many meetings and indeed delightful evenings spent with John and Anne, two landmark moments stand out in my mind. In March 1999, Downing Street summoned an array of sociologists, economists, and social affairs journalists to hear Tony Blair's Beveridge lecture delivered at Toynbee Hall. I sat next to John as we listened with astonishment to the Prime Minister's pledge to abolish child poverty by 2020. Yes, abolish it. Well, we looked at each other and I asked John in a whisper if he'd heard what I'd heard. And did he really mean it? Had Tony Blair any idea what it would take? John thought probably not. But afterwards, we agreed that those high ambitions, those mountains, was the only hope of setting out to shift child poverty numbers. I checked in with him regularly on how Labour was doing. What more would it take, as he chronicled and monitored Labour's progress with precision and with great fairness. In the end, in 2010, just after Labour fell from power, he produced his magisterial audit, An Anatomy of Inequality. For David Walker and I, his work and his generous advice was a vital part of our book, The Verdict, assessing the effects of 13 years of Labour government. John's analysis of inequality showed how much class outweighed all other disadvantages. Differences in income, wealth, opportunity within ethnic, gender, or disability groups were greater than between them and the rest. Reading his final analysis of Labour's achievements is a hard lesson. Yes, Labour had lifted a third of poor children above the poverty line by 2010. Income inequality had only slightly narrowed, though it hadn't worsened as it would certainly have done under the previous government's planned trajectory. But the child of disadvantage still entered primary school 6 months behind a middle-class child, and the dim but well-off child would rapidly overtake the high achiever from a poor family, who would probably pass that class disadvantage on to the next generation. All that was in John's audit. He never lost his ability to be shocked by these findings. He looked for new ways to describe them, new ways to present the facts and reach out to a public that decides how much a government should care. His surveys analysed how little the public knew about inequality, about where they stood on the income scale, or what other people earned above and below them. Without knowing, how could they decide and vote on what was going to be fair? Writing our book, Unjust Rewards, David Walker and I called on John to help with 2 focus groups that we assembled with Ipsos Mori. One was of very highly paid city lawyers and the other of top city bankers. He sent them a questionnaire at the start to find out what they knew of the earnings of others. He collated their answers on a big screen and set them up against the actual facts so they could see how wildly ignorant they were of the distribution of the nation's wealth that they controlled. They imagined the poverty line was twice as high as its actual pitiful level. They thought a majority were in their own high tax bracket, and they refused to believe that it was only 10%. But it's everyone we know, they protested. Only by having the great authority of the LSE's John Hills to tell them they were wrong would they grudgingly believe it. But even then in the discussion, they found 100 justifications for earning 100 times more than a nurse. Again, John was himself shocked by them, by their ignorance, the rigidity of their views and their utter lack of social curiosity. Let me just say finally a word about John's great goodness of heart and the strength of his values. It seemed never to occur to him to keep for himself what he could give away to others, shrugging off privilege wherever he could. Yet he wore his exceptional virtue very lightly. He and Anne have always been, in their own lives, beacons for those great values that were enshrined in their work. Thank you.
I think if I'm right, our next speaker, Adair Turner, has just arrived, so that was very timely. Lord Adair Turner chairs the Energy Transitions Commission, a global coalition working to achieve net zero economy by 2040. Alongside a business career, Lord Turner has had several public policy roles, the most relevant of which for his work with John was on the Pensions Commission between 2003 and 2006. But, thank you, I'm very glad you could make it.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad that I could come here this afternoon in memory of John. I think it was a huge sadness to all of us that he passed away during the COVID crisis, and that therefore we didn't have the opportunity to, as it were, say goodbye to him and pass on our commiserations to Anne at the time of his death. It certainly, when it occurred, made me remember very strongly 3 years of my life from 2003 to 2006 as chair of the Pension Commission. There were just 3 of us on that Pension Commission, myself, Jeannie Drake, and John. And it was a wonderful opportunity to work with John and to understand what a wonderful economist, what a wonderful academic, and what a wonderful human being he was. We worked together, John and Jeannie and I, with a great secretariat, about 20 in total, and we spent a lot of time sitting with that secretariat as they presented to us the data on the UK pension system, who had what savings, what they were going to get from the state, who had saved privately, what that was going to do to distribution and adequacy. And I remember lengthy meetings as we went through on slide decks. But I have to tell you that to the development of our thinking, it was equally important that every 4 months and on a rotation between each other's houses, each of us in turn was the chef. And we would cook a dinner for each other and have a fine bottle of wine and debate where we had got to, what was coming out of the analysis, how bold we were going to be politically, because it was quite a fraught issue, let us say, on the Blair-Brown divide at the time. And it was in those dinners that I think more than anything else, both we developed our thinking and that I really got to know John. I would say that 3 things stand out in my memory of John. First is, and this may seem an odd thing to say, just a tenacious attention to detail, a meticulous love of getting the facts right. And I have to say, I love that because I like that as well. And so you respond to a kindred soul who actually can look at a really crowded slide with a lot of facts and say, but hang on, is this one absolutely right? Because it doesn't seem to relate to what was on slide 23. And I've already looked ahead at the pack to slide 67, and I'm not sure those figures reconcile. Now, that is absolutely John, and he would not let go until he was absolutely sure that we were building our conclusions on facts. The second thing was a commitment to fact-based policy. And that shouldn't be a rare thing to say, but we live in a world in which policy-based facts are far more the general pattern of a lot of political processes. John believed, as I did believe, and Jeannie believed, that we had to start with the facts. We had to work out, what was going on in the UK pension system? What was it doing? What was it not doing? Who was getting what? And we also had to take those facts and take them wherever they led us, and if that led us away from our priors, then we shouldn't, pursue our priors. We should respect the facts and we should understand it. He was also a very fine, of course, economist, a person steeped in the basic disciplines of economics, both micro and macro, of understanding that economics is a tool that you can use to understand the way the world is and to develop answers to policy problems, which, because they are based on sound theory and understanding, are more likely to survive over time. But actually, what one most remembers about John is that he combined all of that with a passionate commitment to making the world a better place for people in general, but in particular, and Polly was mentioning this right now, for people for whom the world didn't automatically make it a great place, for the people who were less well advantaged and who needed a helping hand from well-designed policy to meet their own possibilities in life. And so we tried to develop an answer to Britain's pensions problem, which was both more economically efficient, but I hope more just and more able to serve as many people's welfare as possible as that which existed before. And for the opportunity to spend 3 years with John working on that, I'm very grateful indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adair. So our final speaker in this section of this afternoon's event is Catherine Hills, John's older sister. She's an archaeologist specialising in the early medieval period in northwestern Europe, especially Eastern Britain. And until retirement, she was a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, is now a senior research fellow at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research and a fellow emerita at Newnham College, Cambridge. Thank you, Catherine.
Well, I hope I can give you all a bit of an idea of where John came from, though I think he owed most of it to himself somehow. I'm speaking for the wider family, for whom John was a much loved and now much missed brother, uncle, cousin. We were a family of 4, myself, my sister Helen, John, and our younger brother Mike. Our father worked in the Met Office as weather forecaster, so he was posted about to RAF stations because in those days there weren't any satellites for weather predictions, so you needed to know on the spot whether your aeroplane should fly or not. Before John was born, we spent 3 years in what was then Rhodesia, then Dunstable, where John was born, Germany, Nottingham, and Abingdon. Despite often moving, the family was stable and happy, though John was once recorded as complaining about his 2 horrid, ugly older sisters. I don't think that was really current all the time. John went first to Nottingham High School and then to Abingdon School. So where did John get his strong principles, his commitment to social issues and political beliefs? We were not a very political family. My parents were of the generation who came back from the war to vote for socialism. And my teddy was named Edward Clement Bear in commemoration of Clement Attlee. But after that, we were broadly left of centre. Father always voted Labour, but in later years, Mother joined the Liberals and reluctantly stayed when they became Lib Dems. We were brought up Christian, we were Anglicans, church every Sunday. Although Father stayed home to put the joint in the oven, Mother said he was agnostic, not atheist. He probably was, reserving judgment in an intelligent, critical manner. John was very like Father in that and many other ways. But perhaps Mother had more active intellectual engagement with both politics and religion. She became a social worker, she was into women's consciousness raising groups, modern theology, and later in life, she is the only person I know who used to watch Today in Parliament on the TV. My parents valued academic achievement. The war had stopped either of them going to university, but 3 of us did. Possibly the most important thing is that they were supportive in whatever we chose to do and brought us up to think for ourselves with confidence in our own abilities. John developed his own interests, his enthusiasm for the Lake District, which came from school trips there, and at Cambridge, as Sue has told us, he was active in student politics of the newspaper and croquet and other things. John's principles did not always work in the real world. Helen and Michael both recall that in 1985, when staying in Zimbabwe, John's egalitarian principles meant he did not employ a house servant, which meant that no one was home during the subsequent burglary. Despite his very busy life in London with Anne and their family, and here at LSE with all of you, John also remained very much a part of our family life, always especially welcome at events where he was so good at organising or participating in games, croquet, cricket, treasure hunts, all remembered well by my children. John was assiduous in visiting Mother, by then living in Christchurch after Father died, and less often I went too, waiting anxiously at the front of the train where I had arrived early for John to arrive at the last minute, jumping on the back. Apart from that, He was a great person to travel with. He always had a backpack full of useful things like a thermos of tea and mats to sit on wet grass with. After Mother died, we got in the habit of having long phone conversations most Sunday mornings. Partly we let off steam about the folly of the government, the frustrations of modern academic life, catching up on our families, but also we did sometimes talk about our work. John didn't have any involvement in archaeology. Our brother Mike spent 2 summers digging with me in Norfolk and later dug in Peru. But John, I only recall visiting an excavation of my husband's in Rome. But I think we had a similar approach to our subjects, preferring a bottom-up analysis of evidence to top-down imposition of theoretical frameworks. Economics and archaeology are more similar in their remit than it might seem. They deal with the individual in society. For archaeology, mostly in the past. How did people live? What were their houses, tools, clothes, and food like? What do their skeletons tell us about their health, diet, ancestry? How far can we reconstruct belief systems or social and political organizations from the material evidence which has survived? How have human beings impacted on the climate for the past 10,000 years? These topics all relate to issues which concern John in relation to the present, which other speakers have talked about. And Mike points out that there are also parallels with medicine, his field, and that inequality is the key driver of unequal health, which John was fully aware of. We're very proud of John, and it's been a privilege for me to be here today and to hear so much about him. Thank you.
So we now come to the part of the afternoon where there's an opportunity for informal contributions and reflections from the floor. There will be 2 roving microphones available, so please just in a moment indicate if you wish to speak and say who you are and try to keep your contributions fairly brief. But whilst you're getting your thoughts together, we wanted to share with you some web pages that we've put together on the CASE website, which collates some of John's outputs, his books, his reviews for government that we've heard about, also some of the recorded lectures and seminars that he gave at LSE. And there's also a link there to the memory wall and the LSE page of tributes for John, so that any of you listening online who wish to add a contribution there, or any of you here today who after the event wish to do so, please do visit the site, both to find out more and remind yourself of some of the things that John did, and also to contribute to the resources there. I also have a small number of contributions to read out from people who hope to be here but aren't able to be. The first here is from Lord Richard Best. Richard says, John was for so many of us the most influential and inspiring social scientist of his time. I had the honour of supporting John's work while at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The first report from this partnership was entitled 39 Steps to Housing Finance Reform. But John told me that he'd thought of 36 and had to find 3 more in order to make it a memorable title. He played a far-reaching role as secretary to the JRF's inquiry into income and wealth, a comprehensive analysis of the increase in poverty from the 1980s to the mid-1990s. Tony Blair quoted from this compelling 1995 report in Parliament, and with Gordon Brown drew on its conclusions in the Labour manifesto for the 1997 election, and the rest is history. John's calm, balanced, clear-sighted use of research evidence, as in his 2012 Fuel Poverty report, made him a powerful advocate for social justice. While mourning his loss, we must be hugely grateful for the enormous contribution he made to making the world a better place. So that was from Lord Richard Best. Can I invite now anybody who wishes to make a contribution from the floor to indicate? Could we have the microphone here, please?
Is this on? I don't know. So my name's Jane Waldfogel, and I've been visiting at Case for about 30 years now. And so I first met John, I think in 1991, during the first of what was to become an annual summer visit. So I've been trying to think about what I could say about John that hasn't been said already. This has been just such a fabulous event. So I guess it's been noted that he didn't really like international travel, and that is true. I can't, it's not even a handful of times that I saw him in the United States. I think he and Anne came once for a visit, maybe to Washington, and he came once to New York kind of mysteriously. I couldn't figure out why he was in New York, and we were talking, I mean, we had breakfast together, and he said, oh, I've got to go off now. I've got this meeting downtown. I said, oh, what are you doing? He said, well, it's the final meeting for this $100 million gift that's coming to LSE. You know, it was the IIE, but he was that casual about it. But that was that got him to the States. But other than that, he really wouldn't come over. But he did have an influence in the United States. So as we've heard today from Gordon Brown on down to Polly Toynbee and other speakers, John was very, very involved with New Labour in inspiring some of the reforms and then in closely studying the reforms. And he also wrote quite a bit for an American audience about this. And at one of the conferences that he was invited to contribute to, he summed up all that New Labour had invested in additional investments in families with children, and it added up to be about another 1% of GDP. And this, you know, it was typical John that he said 1% for the children. I think actually for an American audience, he said 1% for the kids. And that became the title of the conference volume that he was at, a book that Bell Sawhill put out from Brookings. And that number still resonates in the States. I'm sorry to say we haven't got there yet with the 1% for the kids. But if you think about the Build Back Better legislation that almost went through in December, put forward by Speaker Pelosi, that deliberately is modeled on the New Labour reforms. And she was aware of John's work. She was aware of this number of 1% for the kids. I mean, I remember seeing her sort of pointing to it, whispering with her aides, well, we should do that here. So he absolutely had an influence in the United States, and I'm sure his legacy will live on there as well as here.
I'll read now a contribution by Polly Vizard, Associate Director of CASE. John has been a source of inspiration, learning and support for more than 2 decades. I met him when I arrived as a research assistant at what was then the Welfare State Programme. The Welfare State Programme and STICERD were an amazing and exciting place for an early career researcher to be. Looking back, John provided incredible support at every stage of my career. And like so many others, I owe so much to him for his backing, especially when I was working on my PhD and developing an interdisciplinary research agenda around multidimensional poverty and inequality, and when I had children. Over the years, John's always been there and made time for so many of us in CASE for research and work advice, to chat through life's ups and downs, and to reflect together on the big issues of the day, from policy challenges under New Labour to the financial crisis, austerity, and Brexit. Another thing that really stands out to me is the way that John brought people together, who themselves then went on to interact and collaborate. CASE over the years has provided a space for people who felt passionate about what John felt passionate about: poverty and inequality, backing up ideas about social justice with empirical evidence, examining expenditure, policies and outcomes, capturing people's lives and experiences, hardship and inequalities, the good times and the bad times, the winners and the losers, using data, giving disadvantaged groups a voice, and being a bridge between academia, NGOs, think tanks, and the policy world. John had a clustering effect, and generations of researchers that have been influenced by and learned from John have themselves linked up and taken forward ideas, methods, and approaches that John thought were important. When John became seriously ill, the pandemic and first lockdown had just happened. We were working on the latest round of CASE analysis of expenditure, policies, and outcomes. And 1 minute John was there in Zoom meetings, planning how we might design a new indicator set and updating us on his work on a social security paper with Keris Cooper. And then suddenly he wasn't. His sudden disappearance from our lives created a huge gap that still remains and that can't and won't be filled. But I feel truly privileged and lucky to have known and worked with John, and hearing and reading everybody's tributes, it's amazing how many others feel the same. He made a difference to so many people's lives. Could we have the microphone here, please, in the middle?
Thank you. I'm Carol Proctor. I was involved in CASE at the beginning of CASE, and I don't really want to go over things that have already been said, because I think that today just reflects John's amazing contribution and amazing ability to do things. But I do want to say that actually one of the things we haven't talked about today is that John really was one of the first people to believe in longitudinal data and looking at people's lives in a longitudinal fashion, both before you could actually do it with the data that was available, and then when the data began to be available. He so pioneered that approach that we now kind of completely take for granted when we think about the British cohort studies and other studies. But John was a real leader there. But I don't really want to talk about his academic achievements because they're so fantastic and everyone's talked about them. I just want to talk about the pleasure it was to work with John. I mean, I came as a health economist. He didn't work in the area of health. He was always incredibly generous in his comments, in his interest, and indeed in allowing differences. I think one of the great things about CASE was we talked about an awful lot of different things from different perspectives and brought those perspectives. And it was really John that allowed that. And as others have said in this room, that he brought to people together. He brought great enjoyment in doing academic life. And that was something incredibly special that I know of very few colleagues. And I've had many colleagues, and I know of very few colleagues who can do it in the way that John did it, and indeed that Anne did it. I remember meetings in which we'd have huge debates, but everybody would go away and have a cup of tea and enjoy each other and benefit from each other's kind of ideas after those meetings. There was never any acrimony that remained. And that was, I think, thanks to John. So I'd like to say thank you to John on my behalf too.
Thank you. I'm Kerry Oppenheim, and I met John when I used to work for the Child Poverty Action Group a very long time ago. And John bounded in to, I think it was our publication subcommittee meeting. And we talked about a book that he wrote for CPAG, which was called Changing Tax. And Changing Tax, as Holly and I were just talking about, was quite sort of revolutionary in its time. It was a sort of A4 production with a black cover and bright colors for the charts. And it made the tax system very clear and very transparent, and its role in creating inequality. And it was much referred to. And it was all the things that people have described so clearly, which is John's intellect and clarity and commitment to social justice, always there. So that was one, that's my first. And also that John was so boyish. John didn't look any different when, in his 60s from the way he looked. And I don't know how old he would have been. It was very early days of IFS. I think IFS just had, like 2 computers and 5 people. So that's a very strong memory. And then later on, when I worked at number 10 in the policy unit, we drew on John many times, both in helping us think about how we translated the Prime Minister's pledge, Tony Blair's pledge to reduce child poverty in a generation, or abolish it in a generation, and how we converted that into something that might be measurable in some way. So he was very influential in thinking through the targets, the child poverty targets that later became legislation, but briefly. And then later on, then Adair, I was not very involved in the Pensions Commission, but only in that very early stage when we had to think about who should be on it. And there was your name and Jeannie Drake, and there was a third place. And I remember we thought of John, you know, in that he would really have this deep analysis of inequality and of what was going on with poor pensioners and all the other things that he had. And it was the first time I can remember having a conversation with Ed Balls, and he was really delighted that we proposed John. So that felt like that was a real success, you know, that John was going to be there. And John talked about, I'm sure you know this, Adair, that how much he really enjoyed and got pleasure from working on that hugely important commission, and the enjoyment of the charts and all the things that you described. I didn't know anything about the dinners though. And then much later and very recently, I worked with Naomi Eisenstadt, who used to run the Shore Start Centre, and John was enabled us to come and work at the International Inequalities Institute, supported by a JRF grant, and we were practitioner researchers, I think is what we were called. And it was such a fantastic place to work. And he was so generous with his time and with his mind. And, you know, you go out to lunch I just don't know how he fitted all of those things in. He never let anybody down. He was always on top of everything. And then watching him with the students, there was I think people had to present their sort of at the end of their masters, they had to present their projects, and the sort of the egalitarian way he always operated, and the way he would listen and contribute, and the students' respect and a pleasure of working with him was so apparent. So that was a fantastic experience. And then really, once he was ill, I was just searching, but I couldn't find them texts. He was on WhatsApp, and he was texting about the government and what it should be doing on universal credit and child benefit, and that commitment throughout his life. I feel really privileged to have encountered him and been lucky enough to work with him, and miss him greatly. Yes.
There's one right at the back there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a former student of the LSE. I came to do a master's here in 1996, just before things got better. And I was obviously very young then, and I was a young housing officer from Reading Borough Council. And it's actually Anne I know personally, but John I saw speak. And I appeared at the LSE. I was very nervous. And first of all, Anne was my tutor, which is pretty formidable. But John was then one of the lecturers on the fantastic social policy course, where you got this panoply of lecturers across really the whole of social policy in the last sort of 40 years. And one of the things it's given me in my career subsequently, where I've been chief exec of a local authority and housing associations and private equity funds and all sorts of fun and games that we now engage with in social housing, was this real sense of, first of all, compassion for people that data gives you. So it proves that not only is it good to help people that are less fortunate than yourselves, but it actually saves the taxpayer money and actually enables all of society to function successfully. And I think that's something that Anne and John brilliantly portrayed in data as well as in brilliant words. And it's been an inspiration for me throughout my career. But also when I returned to the LSE to listen to John talk about the Hills report, which I knew it as at the time 15 years ago. And then I was in my first chief exec role at a housing organisation. When I went back, everyone said how smart and clever I sounded, because I could quote a number of data and longitudinal and latitudinal numbers about the sets that we're working in. But that was all down to John and to Anne. And I think those of us who, I wouldn't want to say I work on the front line, but I'm out there working with tenants day in, day out. I think we owe John and Anne a huge debt of gratitude to enabling us to be brave, to really stand up for people at all times, and to remember that things can only get better in the future. Don't know where that came from. So vote for me.
The microphone over here, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Summers. I was one of John's PhD students. I think Francesca and Kitty especially summed up what a special and privileged thing it is to be part of the CASE community and to be one of John's students. But the thing I wanted actually links what you were just saying. The memory that comes to mind is something I wrote in my card to John when I finished my PhD, which was I was also taught by him as a master's student here at LSE. And it is seared on my mind, the first lecture that John gave of the course actually that Coretta talked about, which I think demonstrates sort of what I take from him as how you should engage with and think about research and why it matters, and kind of the example he set in this lecture. He read an extract from Peter Townsend's Poverty in the United Kingdom, and there's a chapter, so a lot of it is surveys, and there's a chapter that's vignettes where it's basically extended stories of the families that took part in the research. And John read an extract of one of these families who'd been asked the question in the survey, do you go on holiday, or how often do you go on holiday? Have you been on holiday? I can't remember the question wording. This is a family living far below the poverty line. This is work done in the 1970s. And then basically the vignette goes on to explain that the family said, oh yes, we do go on holiday. We saved up almost all year and we went to the cinema. And so there's this story about this family being very sort of proud and explaining how they went to the cinema as their holiday. And as John read this in the lecture, his voice broke and he found it very emotional to read it. And I was just blown away that someone would care so much about their work, but also the kind of various levels of points he was making methodologically about what we're doing when we do this sort of research, and how we do it matters. And that's just one example, but sort of maybe impresses on me how John approaches his work and the kind of inspiration I draw from him. Thanks.
We've perhaps got time for one last contribution here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name's David Utting. I knew John as a student journalist in Cambridge many years ago. I was reminded actually by what Carey said about the CPAG report on tax and poverty, because I had a small bet with John later on in life that I couldn't get that into the Today newspaper, and I won the bet, so that was okay. This is a warning from history, really, because at one point, and Anne will probably correct me if I'm wrong about this, John either considered applying to the Liverpool Daily Post and Echo for a traineeship in journalism, or actually got offered an interview. I can't remember which it was, but there was the potential for a different path at that point. And thank goodness, thank goodness that he didn't go in that direction and went in the way that he did. I'm afraid I did go into newspapers for quite a long while. In relation to the Today newspaper, I remember very clearly a deputy editor who'd come from being an associate editor of the Daily Mail, who said to me at interview, the thing that really matters about the newspapers, the thing that really matters is strong opinions. That's what it is, strong opinions, that's what matters. Well, I'm thinking here today that in government we'd reached the apotheosis, if you like, of that view of the world, and that what matters is strong opinions, apparently, and not knowing anything and not knowing any facts. And it was wonderful to hear what Adair Turner said about John's principled love of fact, something which I came across later on in life when I worked for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And it was a great honor and a privilege to work with John on some of those reports, in putting them out into the public domain. And I think it was about that point that I realized just how brilliant my friend from earlier days was. So I think if, as Torsten has said, we're going to build on giants' shoulders with John, let's start getting back to evidence-based policy making. Let's start getting back to fact. That way we can do right by John. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've got one last piece to read, which is from Professor Lindsay Macmillan, who's Director of Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities at the University College London. Lindsay writes, I find it hard to process that John won't be sitting in his office at Case next time I pop in. I won't be greeted by his open door and huge smile. One of the many wonderful things about John that I will miss is how welcoming he always made you feel. No matter how busy he was, and he was very, very busy, he made time to find out what was going on in your life, both professional and personal. I'll miss his knowledge, his wisdom, his advice, his humble nature, and most of all, his kindness. I'm thinking of Anne and of everyone at Case and at LSE who knew and cared for him. What an incredible man we have lost. So I'd remind you again of the opportunity to share any further thoughts you may have on the tribute page, and very many thanks to Calliope Vakaropoulou, who has worked hard and long to get these pages together. I'll hand back now to Minouche to close the event.
So as I was listening to all of you, I found myself thinking, I wish John was here. And then I found myself thinking, I wish we had cloned him many times, because the world would be a much better place with more Johns in it. And he's taught us all so many things, but I think the thing he taught us most was to how to lead a good life. And so maybe the biggest tribute we can pay to John is to lead a good life and to hold on to the things that he taught us. Things like loving data and analysis. Things like a commitment to social justice and to personal integrity and modesty and magic and making people happy and never letting anyone down and sharing calculators and creuset pots and playing croquet and confidence that things will get better. And that generosity of spirit that touched all of us. And while we all stood on his shoulders, let's keep John on ours. That's a little quiet voice that reminds us how to lead a good life. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for all your contributions. And I would now invite all of you to join us for a reception on the 5th floor of this building, and the stewards in the back will guide you there. And just a final thanks to all the people who have helped contribute to organizing the event today. It was a huge amount of work and very well worth waiting for. Thank you.